In 1966, in the oldest neighborhood of Mexico City, there was a butcher named Aurelio who had a gift. His cuts were perfect. His prices were unbeatable. His customers traveled from across the city just to buy from him. Mothers said his meat made their children ask for seconds. Fathers said Sunday barbecues had never tasted so good. For 8 months, Aurelio Mendoza was the most beloved vendor in the San Juan Market. Nobody questioned why his meat was 40% cheaper than everyone else's. Nobody wondered why it had that unique flavor that no other butcher could replicate. Nobody asked where it came from. They just kept buying. They kept cooking. They kept feeding their families. And then one morning, a health inspector named Elena Morales noticed something strange about the texture of Aurelio's finest cut. She saw what looked like a birthmark on the meat, and when she asked what kind of animal has birthmarks, Aurelio smiled and said nothing at all. If you have ever tasted meat that seemed different from anything you had tried before, this story is going to stay with you. I promise that by the end, you will never walk through a market the same way again. Hit the like button right now if you want more stories like this one. Subscribe to this channel because every week I bring you cases that were buried and forgotten. Turn on notifications so you never miss an upload, and leave me a comment telling me where you are watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. Now let us begin. The San Juan Market had stood in the same location since 1892. It was one of those buildings that seemed to have grown out of the earth rather than being built by human hands. The walls were thick adobe covered in decades of grime. The ceiling soared high above the stalls, supported by iron beams that had rusted into the color of dried blood. Narrow corridors snaked between vendors selling everything from fresh vegetables to live chickens to cuts of meat that hung from hooks like strange fruit. In October of 1966, the market served over 2,000 customers every day. Most came from the surrounding neighborhoods, working-class families who counted every peso and knew exactly where to find the best deals. But there was a section of the market that attracted a different kind of customer. People who came from wealthier neighborhoods, people who drove cars instead of taking buses, people who were willing to travel 30 minutes across the city for meat they could have bought 5 minutes from their homes. That section had 5 butcher stalls, and all 5 were connected in ways that nobody understood until it was far too late. Aurelio Mendoza ran the largest stall. He was 53 years old in 1966, a man with thick forearms and hands that had spent decades working with knives. His face was weathered from years of waking before dawn, and his eyes had a quality that customers interpreted as warmth, but that Elena Morales would later describe as something else entirely. He had been selling meat at the San Juan Market for 27 years. He knew every regular customer by name. He remembered their preferences, their children's birthdays, their family recipes. He was, by all appearances, the kind of vendor who made markets feel like communities rather than just places to buy things. 2 stalls down from Aurelio was the Herrera family operation. Tomas Herrera handled the business side, while his wife Carmen worked the counter during the day. They had arrived at the market 3 years earlier and had quickly built a reputation for quality cuts at reasonable prices. Tomas was a quiet man who rarely smiled, but Carmen had a gift for making customers feel welcome. She remembered names and faces and always asked about sick relatives and new grandchildren. The other 3 stalls were smaller operations run by men who had worked at the market for varying lengths of time. What connected all 5 was something that none of their customers knew. They all received their meat from the same supplier, a man who arrived every Wednesday night in a refrigerated truck. A man who never gave his real name but who everyone called Dr. Ramirez. Elena Morales had worked as a health inspector for the federal district for 25 years. She had seen things that would make most people lose their appetite permanently. Rats living inside walls of restaurants. Cockroaches so numerous they looked like moving carpets. Meat that had been sitting at room temperature for days being sold as fresh. She had developed an instinct for detecting problems that others missed. A 6th sense that told her when something was wrong, even before she could identify exactly what it was. On the morning of October 3rd, Elena arrived at the San Juan Market for what she expected to be a routine inspection. She had visited hundreds of markets over her career and had developed an efficient system. Check the refrigeration temperatures, examine the storage areas, review the documentation, look for obvious signs of contamination or improper handling. Most inspections took less than 2 hours and resulted in nothing more than minor citations for paperwork violation. But something felt different the moment she entered the meat section of the San Juan Market. The smell was the first thing she noticed. Every butcher stall has a particular odor, a combination of blood and fat and the metallic tang of raw flesh. Elena had smelled thousands of butcher stalls in her career, She knew what normal smelled like, and this was not quite normal. There was something underneath the expected odors, something she could not identify, but that made the hair on her arms stand up. She approached Aurelio Mendoza's stall first, because it was the largest and most prominent. The display case was immaculate, filled with cuts of meat arranged with almost artistic precision. The colors were vibrant, the marbling was beautiful, and the prices written on small cards were significantly lower than what Elena had seen at other markets. Aurelio greeted her with a broad smile that showed teeth stained yellow from decades of coffee. He wiped his hands on his apron, leaving fresh red streaks across the already stained fabric. "Good morning," he said. "You must be from the health department. We have been expecting an inspection. Everything is in order, I assure you." Elena noted that he had been expecting her. Routine inspections were not announced in advance. Someone had warned him. She asked to see his documentation. Supplier certificates, sanitary permits, purchase invoices. Aurelio's smile flickered for just a moment before he explained that the paperwork was in his office in the back, but that he was too busy with customers right now to retrieve it. Perhaps she could return later in the afternoon. Elena had heard this excuse hundreds of times. It usually meant that the documentation either did not exist or would not survive close examination. She made a note in her book and asked a different question. "Your prices are very competitive," she said. "How do you manage to sell at 40% below the market average?" Aurelio's hands stopped moving. For 3 seconds he was completely still. Then the smile returned, and he explained that he had a special arrangement with suppliers from the interior of the country. Ranchers who sold directly to him, cutting out the middlemen. It was simply good business. Elena nodded and asked another question, the one that would eventually unravel everything. She pointed to a cut of meat in the display case. There was a mark on it, a discoloration that looked almost like a scar or a birthmark. She asked what kind of animal had marks like that on its flesh. Aurelio looked at the meat, then looked at Elena. His eyes changed in that moment. The warmth that customers saw was gone. What replaced it was something cold and calculated. "Farm animals have difficult lives," he said slowly. "Sometimes they get injured. It does not affect the quality of the meat." Elena thanked him and moved on to the next stall. But she did not forget what she had seen in his eyes, and she did not forget the mark on the meat that looked like no animal injury she had ever encountered. Over the next 3 hours, Elena visited all 8 butcher stalls in that section of the market. 5 of them displayed the same characteristics: unusually low prices, evasive answers about suppliers, documentation that was always somewhere else, and meat with a texture and coloring that Elena could not quite categorize. The other 3 stalls seemed normal. Their prices were standard, their paperwork was in order, and their meat looked exactly like what Elena expected beef and pork to look like. She left the market that afternoon with more questions than answers. But her instinct was screaming at her that something was deeply wrong. That night, she called a colleague named Roberto Mendoza, a veterinarian who specialized in identifying animal species from tissue samples. She asked him to accompany her back to the market the next day. Roberto was skeptical. He had known Elena for 15 years and respected her instincts, but what she was suggesting seemed impossible. Surely if something was wrong with the meat, customers would. Surely someone would have complained. Elena reminded him that people see what they expect to see, that customers who trust a vendor do not question what they are buying, that the human mind is remarkably good at ignoring evidence that contradicts its assumptions. Roberto agreed to come with her, but neither of them was prepared for what they would discover. If you are still watching, I need to tell you that this story is about to take a turn that you might not be ready for. What Elena and Roberto found in that market is something that most people would prefer not to know, something that challenges everything we believe about trust and community and the food we put in our bodies. If you want to stop here, I understand, but if you want to know the truth, keep watching. Because the truth is something that the Mexican government buried for decades, and someone needs to tell it. Roberto arrived at Elena's apartment at 6 in the morning on October 4th. He brought a bag containing basic analysis tools, a magnifying glass, sample containers, rubber gloves, a small microscope that could provide preliminary results in the field. They took a bus to the market, arriving just as the vendors were setting up for the day. The plan was simple. Roberto would examine the meat at each of the 5 suspicious stalls, while Elena distracted the vendors with questions about their business. If Roberto found anything unusual, he would signal her with a predetermined phrase. The market was already filling with early morning customers when they arrived: housewives with shopping bags, restaurant owners looking for bulk purchases, elderly men who came every day out of habit more than necessity. They approached Aurelio's stall first. The butcher recognized Elena immediately, and his expression soured before he forced the smile back onto his face. Back so soon, he said. I am afraid the documentation is still not ready. There was a problem with the filing system. Elena introduced Roberto as her colleague and explained that they needed to conduct a more thorough inspection. Aurelio had no legal grounds to refuse, though his displeasure was obvious. Roberto began examining the meat in the display case with his magnifying. Elena watched his face carefully, looking for any sign that he had found something significant. For several minutes, nothing happened. Roberto moved methodically from cut to cut, his expression neutral and professional. Then he stopped. He was examining a large cut from near the back of the display case. His magnifying glass hovered over one spot for nearly a full minute. When he finally looked up, his face had gone pale. Elena, he said quietly, I need to see the storage area. Aurelio protested that the storage area was for employees only. Elena reminded him that health inspectors had legal authority to examine any part of a food preparation or storage facility. Aurelio's smile disappeared entirely. He stepped aside and gestured toward a door at the back of the stall. The storage area was small and cold, kept at refrigeration temperatures by a unit that hummed loudly in the corner. Meat hung from hooks along one wall. Boxes of wrapped cuts were stacked along another. Everything appeared clean and properly maintained. Roberto walked slowly along the row of hanging meat, examining each piece through his magnifying glass. He stopped at the third piece and leaned in close. Then he pulled out a small knife and, without asking permission, cut a tiny sample from the meat. He placed it in one of his containers and sealed it. What are you doing? Aurelio demanded from. You cannot just cut my merchandise. Roberto ignored him. He continued down the row, taking samples from 3 more pieces of. His hands were trembling slightly, though his face remained professionally neutral. When he finished, he turned to Elena and said the predetermined phrase that meant he had found something significant. I think we should discuss this outside. They left the storage area with Aurelio following close behind, demanding to know what was happening. Elena told him they would be in touch and guided Roberto out of the market and onto the street. They walked 3 blocks in silence before Roberto finally spoke. Elena, he said, I need to get these samples to a proper laboratory, but I can tell you right now that what I saw under magnification is not consistent with any livestock animal I have ever examined. Elena felt her stomach drop. What do you mean? The muscle fiber patterns are wrong, Roberto explained. The fat distribution is wrong. Even the coloration is wrong. Whatever animal that meat came from, it was not a cow. It was not a pig. It was not a goat or a sheep or a horse. Then what was it? Roberto stopped walking and turned to face her. I do not want to say until I have laboratory confirmation. But Elena, I have examined thousands of tissue samples in my career. I know what animal muscle looks like. And that meat has characteristics that I have only seen in one type of mammal. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Elena understood exactly what he was suggesting. The laboratory results came back the next day. Roberto had called in a favor from a pathologist named Dr. Arturo Salinas at the National University. Dr. Salinas had agreed to rush the analysis, though he had been skeptical about Roberto's preliminary concerns. His skepticism vanished within hours of examining the samples. The 3 of them met in Dr. Salinas's laboratory that the pathologist was a man in his 60s with white hair and steady hands that had performed thousands of autopsies over his career. But his hands were not steady as he showed Elena and Roberto what he had found. He projected microscope images onto a screen. The muscle fibers were long and striated, with a density and pattern that he explained was unmistakable. These samples are human tissue, he said. There is no question. The cellular structure, the fiber arrangement, the presence of specific proteins that are unique to human muscle. All 5 samples from all 5 stalls. Human flesh. Elena sat in silence as the confirmation washed over her. Part of her had known since she first saw the mark on that cut of meat in Aurelio's display case. But knowing and having proof were different things. Proof meant that what had seemed impossible was actually real. How many? She asked quietly. Dr. Salinas shook his head. That I cannot tell you from these samples. But based on what you described about the volume of sales at those stalls, we are talking about a significant operation. This is not someone disposing of one body. This is an ongoing supply chain. Roberto asked the question that Elena could not bring herself to voice. Where are the bodies coming from? Dr. Salinas had no answer. But he had observations. Whoever is processing these bodies has medical training, he said. The cuts are precise and follow anatomical guidelines. They know exactly where to separate muscle groups for maximum yield. This is professional work. That night, Elena went to the judicial police. She brought the laboratory reports, the photographs, the testimonies from Roberto and Dr. Salinas. Commander Raul Vasquez listened to her presentation with an expression that shifted from skepticism to horror to cold determination. By midnight, a plan was in. Undercover officers would stake out the market. Surveillance would be established on all 5 vendors. When the supplier arrived with his next delivery, they would follow him back to wherever the bodies were being processed. The trap was set for Wednesday night, but the vendors had been warned. Let me pause here because I need you to understand something important. Everything I have told you so far is documented in files that were classified by the Mexican government for reasons of public safety. What I am about to tell you was never officially confirmed. The government decided that some truths were too disturbing for public consumption, that the trauma of knowledge would be worse than the comfort of ignorance. You are about to learn what they tried to hide. The police surveillance on Wednesday night captured something unexpected. The refrigerated truck that usually arrived around 11 did not come. The 5 vendors closed their stalls at the normal time and went home. Everything appeared ordinary, but one officer noticed something. Tomas Herrera, instead of going directly home, took a detour through a series of back streets. The officer followed at a distance and watched Tomas enter a warehouse on the outskirts of the city near a town called Texcoco. The warehouse was reported to Commander Vasquez, who made a decision that would haunt him for years. Instead of waiting for more information, he ordered an immediate raid. 20 officers surrounded the building at 3 a.m. on Thursday, October 6th. What they found inside would become the most closely guarded secret in the history of Mexico City law enforcement. The warehouse had been converted into a processing facility. 3 stainless steel tables dominated the center of the space, each equipped with drainage channels and overhead hooks. The walls were lined with surgical instruments, bone saws, and butchering equipment. Industrial refrigeration units hummed along the back wall, and inside those refrigeration units were the remains of human beings. Arms separated at the shoulder and elbow, legs sectioned at the hip and knee, torsos split and drained, heads removed and stored in a separate container. The forensic team counted remains from at least 18 different individuals. Most appeared to be adults between 20 and 40 years old. Some showed signs of tattoos or surgical scars that might eventually help identify them. Most did not. In a small office attached to the processing area, investigators found documentation that revealed the source of the bodies, correspondence with hospitals and morgues throughout Mexico City, records of bodies that had been officially designated for medical research or cremation, but had instead been diverted to this facility, names of officials who had been bribed to look the other way. The operation had been running for at least 3 years. Hundreds of bodies had passed through this warehouse. Thousands of families had consumed the results. The man they called Dr. Ramirez was never found. By the time police arrived at the addresses listed in the documentation, he had vanished. The name was false. The credentials were forged. Every trail led to dead ends. What investigators pieced together from the evidence and interrogations was a picture of methodical, calculated horror. Dr. Ramirez had medical training, possibly as a pathologist or medical examiner. He had connections within the city's hospital system that allowed him to identify bodies that would not be missed. Homeless individuals who died in emergency rooms, unidentified accident, patients whose families were too poor to pay for proper burial. He processed the bodies with surgical precision, removing identifying features and sectioning the remains into cuts that resembled conventional meat. He sold the product to vendors at prices low enough to ensure they would not ask questions, then high enough to generate substantial profit. The 5 vendors at the San Juan Market were not the only outlets. Evidence suggested similar arrangements at markets throughout the city, though none of those connections could ever be proven. The case was closed quietly. The 5 vendors were convicted of various charges and sentenced to prison terms ranging from 8 to 15 years. The warehouse was demolished, the market was shut down permanently, and the public was told nothing. Officially, the San Juan Market was closed due to structural concerns with the building. The vendors were arrested for tax evasion and selling uninspected meat. The truth was buried in classified files with instructions that they remain sealed indefinitely. The families who had purchased meat from those stalls were never notified. The government decided that telling thousands of people they had unknowingly consumed human flesh would cause more harm than good. That ignorance was protection. That silence was mercy. I need to ask you something before I continue, and I want you to really think about your answer. If you had been one of those families, would you want to know? Would you want someone to tell you that the special meat your children loved, the meat that made your Sunday dinners memorable, was not what you thought it was? There is no right answer. Some people need truth regardless of the pain it causes. Others prefer comfortable ignorance to devastating knowledge. Elena Morales chose truth, and that choice destroyed her. Leave your answer in the comments. Tell me what you would choose. Because the people who lived this story had to make that choice, and many of them are still living with the consequences today. Elena received a commendation for her work on a small ceremony, a certificate, a handshake from officials who thanked her for her service while simultaneously ordering her to never speak publicly about what she had discovered. She tried to comply. She returned to her job, conducted her inspections, filed her reports. But something had changed inside her. She could not look at meat without remembering what she had seen in that warehouse. She could not walk through a market without wondering what secrets were hiding behind the smiles of vendors. Her colleagues noticed the change. She became withdrawn and paranoid. She requested reassignment to a desk job where she would not have to conduct field inspection. When that request was denied, she resigned. Elena moved to Guadalajara in 1968. She never worked in food inspection again. She never spoke publicly about the San Juan Market case. She died in 1998 at the age of 79, having kept the secret for over 30 years. But others were not so successful at maintaining silence. Roberto Mendoza, the veterinarian who first identified the unusual tissue patterns, suffered a breakdown in 1970. He began telling people about the case, insisting that the public had a right to know what they had eaten. He was institutionalized for 6 months and diagnosed with delusional disorder. When he was released, he never spoke of the case again. Dr. Salinas, the pathologist who confirmed the human origin of the samples, continued his career at the National University, but colleagues noticed that he refused to eat meat for the rest of his life. When asked why, he would simply say that he had seen things that changed his understanding of what humans were capable of. The families who had purchased from the 5 stalls went on with their lives, unaware of what they had consumed. Some of them are still alive today. Some have children and grandchildren who grew up hearing stories about the wonderful butcher at the old market, the one whose meat was so tender and flavorful that nothing else ever compared. They do not know. They will probably never know, and maybe that is for the best. But there are others who found out, who stumbled upon fragments of the truth through old newspaper articles or whispered conversations with elderly relatives, who began asking questions and received answers that shattered everything they believed about their own history. One of those people contacted me during my research for this story. His name was Carlos, and he was 10 years old when the San Juan Market was closed. His family had been regular customers at Aurelio Mendoza's stall for 3 years. Carlos told me that his parents changed after the market closed. His father became distant and refused to discuss anything related to food shopping. His mother began preparing only vegetarian meals, a dramatic change for a traditional Mexican family. When Carlos asked why, he was told that it was for health reasons. He accepted that explanation for 40 years. In 2010, Carlos was cleaning out his mother's apartment after her death when he found a folder of old newspaper clippings, articles about food safety, reports about market closures, and one article, heavily underlined, about vendors arrested for selling uninspected meat. Carlos began researching. He found others who remembered the San Juan Market. He found retired police officers who would speak off the record. He found fragments of the truth that his parents had spent their lives hiding from him. When he finally understood what his family had eaten during those 3 years of Sunday dinners, Carlos said he felt something break inside him. It was not just the horror of what we had consumed, he told me. It was the realization that my parents had known. They had figured it out somehow, or they had been told by someone, and they had chosen to protect me from the truth by never speaking of it again. They carried that weight for the rest of their lives, so that I would not have to. Carlos asked me not to use his real name in this story. He has children of his own now, and he has made the same choice his parents made. He has decided not to pass the knowledge on to the next generation. Some truths, he said, are too heavy for anyone to carry. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is bear the weight yourself. I do not know if I agree with that. I do not know if silence is ever truly kind when it means that victims go unacknowledged and crimes go unremembered. But I understand the impulse. I understand the desire to protect the people you love from knowledge that serves no purpose except to cause pain. The San Juan Market case raises questions that have no satisfying answers. Who were the people whose bodies ended up in that warehouse? They had names once. Families. Lives that mattered to someone. They deserved better than to be processed like livestock and sold to unknowing consumers. They deserved to be buried with dignity or cremated according to their wishes. Instead, they became products, commodities, meat. We will probably never know their names. The records were incomplete, and many of the bodies had been processed beyond any possibility of identification. They exist now only as numbers in a classified file. 18 confirmed, possibly hundreds more over the 3 years the operation ran. And what about Dr. Ramirez, the man who designed and operated this system of horror? He was never caught, never identified, never brought to justice. He simply vanished, presumably to continue his work elsewhere or to retire on the profits of his terrible enterprise. Some investigators believe he fled to South America. Others think he simply adopted a new identity and continued living in Mexico, perhaps even continuing to supply other markets with his special product. The truth is that nobody knows. Nobody will ever know. The case of the San Juan Market demonstrates something uncomfortable about human nature. We trust systems. We trust familiar faces. We trust that the food we buy has been inspected and approved, that the vendors we patronize are honest, that the meat we feed our children comes from animals and not from our fellow human beings. That trust is usually justified. The vast majority of butchers and vendors are exactly what honest people making an honest living. But sometimes they are not. Sometimes the smile that makes you feel welcome is hiding something monstrous. Sometimes the low prices that seem like good luck are actually warnings that something is wrong. Sometimes the meat that tastes better than anything you have ever tried has a reason for being different. The San Juan Market case was not unique. Similar cases have been documented throughout history, in countries around the world. The details vary, but the pattern is consistent. Someone with access to bodies, someone with the skills to process them, someone with the connections to distribute the product, and customers who never think to question what they are buying. Most of these cases are never discovered. The perpetrators operate for years or decades before something goes wrong. A health inspector who notices something strange, a supplier who talks too much, a body that is identified before it can be processed. How many similar operations are running right now, in markets and butcher shops around the world? How many customers are consuming products they would never willingly eat if they knew the truth? I do not have answers to those questions. Nobody does. And maybe that uncertainty is the most disturbing part of this entire story. The knowledge that we cannot truly know what we are eating. That trust can be exploited. That horror can hide in plain sight behind a friendly smile and a good price. Next week, I will tell you another story. One about a boarding house in San Luis Potosí where guests checked in and never checked out. The owner was not interested in their bodies. He wanted something more valuable, their identities. And some of those identities are still being used today, decades later, by people who have no idea where they originally came from. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you do not miss it. Before I go, I want to leave you with one final thought. The next time you walk through a market, pay attention. Notice the vendors who seem too eager to make a sale. Notice the prices that seem too good to be true. Notice the meat that has a texture or color that does not quite match what you expect. You will probably find nothing wrong. The overwhelming odds are that everything is exactly what it appears to be. But Elena Morales thought the same thing when she walked into the San Juan Market on October 3, 1966. She thought it would be a routine inspection. She thought she had seen everything there was to see. She was wrong. And if she had not noticed that birthmark on a cut of meat, if she had not asked that one simple question, the operation might have continued for decades. The vendors would have grown old and passed their stalls to their children. The supplier would have continued his deliveries every Wednesday night. And families would have continued feeding their loved ones without ever knowing what they were really eating. One question, one moment of attention. That was all it took to unravel everything. Maybe that is the lesson. Not that horror is everywhere, because it is not. But that horror depends on our inattention to survive. It depends on us not asking questions, not looking too closely, not trusting our instincts when something feels. Elena trusted her instincts. She asked the question. She looked closely. And she found the truth. What would you find if you looked closely enough? The city is always hungry. Make sure you know what you are feeding it. And make sure you know what it is feeding you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And thank you for choosing to know the truth, even when the truth is hard to swallow. See you next week. Stay curious. Stay vigilant. And never stop asking questions. There is something else I need to share with you. Something that did not make it into the official files, but that I discovered through interviews with people who were connected to the case. In 1974, 8 years after the San Juan Market was closed, there were reports of similar irregularities at a market in the northern part of Mexico City. A health inspector noted unusual characteristics in meat being sold at several stalls. He began an investigation. 3 days later, he was found dead in his apartment. The official cause of death was listed as suicide, but his family never believed it. He had been planning a vacation with his wife. He had just bought birthday presents for his daughter. He was not a man contemplating ending his own life. The investigation into the market irregularities was quietly closed. The stalls continued operating. No further inspections were conducted. Was there a connection to the San Juan Market case? Was Dr. Ramirez still operating somewhere in the city, protected by people who had reason to keep his business alive? Nobody knows for certain. But the timing was suspicious, and the inspector's death ensured that whatever was happening at that northern market would never be exposed. I found records of 3 other health inspectors who died under unusual circumstances in Mexico City between 1968 and 1982. All of them had been investigating food safety issues. All of their deaths were ruled accidental or self-inflicted. All of their cases were closed without resolution. Coincidence is possible, but patterns are hard to ignore. Elena Morales survived because she had institutional support from the beginning. She had Roberto and Dr. Salinas as witnesses. She had gone directly to the judicial police with evidence that could not be dismissed. By the time anyone might have wanted to silence her, too many people already knew what she had discovered. The other inspectors worked alone. They asked questions privately. They gathered evidence quietly. And they died before they could share what they had learned with anyone who could protect them. I do not want to suggest that there is a vast conspiracy surrounding the meat industry in Mexico. That would be irresponsible speculation. But I do want you to understand that the San Juan Market case exists within a larger context. A context of unexplained deaths and closed investigations and secrets that powerful people have reason to keep buried. Elena understood this context better than anyone. It was one of the reasons she agreed to stay silent after the case was classified, not because she believed in protecting the public from difficult truths, but because she understood that speaking out might cost her everything. She made a choice. Safety over truth. Silence over justice. I am not in a position to judge that choice. None of us are, unless we have faced the same impossible decision. But I can tell you that she regretted it. In the final years of her life, Elena began writing a memoir. She never finished it, and her family destroyed most of the manuscript after her death, respecting her wishes. But fragments survived. Notes and outlines that her granddaughter preserved without fully understanding their significance. I obtained copies of those fragments during my research. Most of them are mundane. Details about her career, her family, her daily life. But there are passages that reveal how the San Juan Market case haunted her until the end. One passage reads, "I have kept silent for 30 years. I have watched as the families who ate that meat raised children and grandchildren, never knowing what I know. I have wondered if my silence was mercy or cowardice. I still do not have an answer, but I know that the dead deserve to be remembered. The 18, the hundreds, however many there were. They were people. They had names, and we erased them." Another passage reads, "I still see Aurelio's face sometimes. That smile. Those eyes that changed when I asked about the birthmark. He knew exactly what he was selling. They all did. And they smiled at their customers and wrapped the meat in paper and sent them home to feed their families. How do you do that? How do you look a mother in the eye while you hand her the flesh of another mother's child? I have spent 30 years trying to understand. I never have." The most disturbing passage is the shortest. I wonder how many are still operating. How many markets? How many vendors? How many bodies? We caught 5 stalls in one market. We closed 1 warehouse. But Ramirez was never found. His contacts were never fully identified. The system we exposed was just one node in something larger. Something that probably still exists. Something that will probably never be stopped. Elena died believing that the horror she had uncovered was not an aberration but a symptom. A symptom of systems that treat human bodies as commodities. A symptom of poverty that makes some lives worth less than others. A symptom of corruption that allows the unthinkable to become routine. She may have been right. The trafficking of human remains is not a historical curiosity. It continues today, in various forms, around the world. Bodies are sold for medical research. Organs are harvested without consent. Tissue is diverted from morgues and funeral homes into black markets that serve customers who do not ask questions about origin. The specific horror of the San Juan Market, the processing of human flesh for consumption, may be rare, but it is not impossible, and the conditions that made it possible in 1966 still exist in many parts of the world. Poverty, corruption, bodies that nobody will miss, customers who trust what they are told. If there is a lesson in Elena's story, it is not that we should live in fear. It is that we should live with awareness, that we should ask questions even when the answers might be uncomfortable, that we should trust our instincts when something feels wrong, even if we cannot explain exactly why. Elena's instinct told her that something was wrong with the meat at Aurelio Mendoza's stall. She could have ignored it. She could have completed her routine inspection and moved on to the next market. Nobody would have blamed her. Nobody would have known. But she asked the question. She looked closer. And in doing so, she ended an operation that might have continued for years. That is the power of attention. The power of one person refusing to accept the easy explanation. The power of curiosity in the face of horror. I want to tell you about one more person before I end this story. A woman named Maria who contacted me after I began posting about my research on social media. Maria is 73 years old. In 1966, she was a young mother living in a neighborhood near the San Juan Market. She shopped there regularly, buying meat from various stalls depending on what looked freshest that day. She remembers Aurelio Mendoza. She remembers his smile, his yellow teeth, the way he always had a kind word for her children. She remembers thinking that he was one of the good ones, a vendor who cared about his customers, rather than just their money. She also remembers the day the market was closed, the confusion as police blocked the entrances, the rumors that spread through the neighborhood about what had been found, the way her husband came home that night with a strange expression and told her they would be buying meat from a different market from. Maria did not learn the full truth until 2008, when her husband confessed on his deathbed. He had known since 1966. A friend who worked for the police had told him what was really in those refrigeration cases. He had spent 42 years keeping the secret from his wife, from his children, from everyone. He asked for her forgiveness as he lay dying. Forgiveness for not telling her sooner. Forgiveness for letting her live in ignorance while he carried the weight alone. Maria told me she gave him that, but she also told me that something changed in those final moments between them. A trust that had defined their marriage for 50 years was revealed to have been incomplete. He had protected her, yes, but he had also deceived her, and she was not sure, even now, which of those facts mattered more. After her husband died, Maria began her own research. She found other families who had shopped at the San Juan Market. She found that many of them had similar stories. Husbands who knew and never told their wives. Parents who knew and never told their children. Entire families bound together by a secret that none of them could bear to speak aloud. Maria started a private support group for these families. They meet twice a month to talk about their experiences, their feelings, their struggles with a truth that most people would not believe. There are currently 17 members. The youngest is 54. The oldest is 86. They do not seek publicity. They do not want the world to know their names or their stories. They simply want a space where they can speak honestly about something that has shaped their lives in ways that are impossible to explain to anyone who has not shared the experience. Maria told me about their meetings because she wanted me to understand something important. The San Juan Market case is not just a historical event. It is not just a story to tell on the internet. It is a living trauma that continues to affect real people today, more than 50 years after the market was closed. Every member of her group has struggled with trust issues. Difficulty believing what they are told, suspicion of institutions that are supposed to protect them, a constant low-level anxiety that the world contains horrors that are being hidden from. Some have had difficulty eating, not just meat, but any food whose origin they cannot personally verify. Some prepare all their meals from raw ingredients they purchase directly from farmers. Some have developed eating disorders that their doctors attribute to unknown causes. Others have struggled with their faith, in God, in humanity, in the basic goodness that we want to believe exists in the world. How do you maintain faith in anything when you know that for 3 years, you unknowingly participated in something monstrous? Maria's group does not have answers. They do not offer healing or closure. They simply offer presence. A room where people can say the unspeakable and know that they will be understood. That is what truth does sometimes. It does not solve problems. It does not make things better. It simply allows us to stop pretending, to acknowledge the reality of what happened, and to share the burden of that acknowledgement with others. I asked Maria if she regretted learning the truth, if she wished her husband had kept the secret until the end, allowing her to live out her days in comfortable ignorance. She thought about the question for a long time before answering. I am glad I know, she finally said. Not because knowing has made me happier. It has not. But because pretending is exhausting. My husband spent 42 years pretending, and it wore him down in ways I only understood after. I would rather carry the weight openly, let it crush me in secret. I think about Maria's answer. I think about the choice between truth and ignorance, between the pain of knowing and the exhaustion of pretending. I do not know which is better. I do not think anyone does. But I know that Maria found something valuable in a community of people who chose truth and who support each other through the consequences of that choice. Maybe that is the best we can hope for. Not answers, but companionship. Not healing, but shared survival. The San Juan Market closed 58 years ago. The vendors served their sentences and have all since died. Dr. Ramirez, whoever he really was, presumably met his end somewhere beyond the reach of justice. The building where the market stood was demolished and is now a parking lot. But the story is not over. It lives in the memories of survivors, in the classified files that remain sealed, in the questions that will never be answered. And now, it lives in you. You have heard the truth that the Mexican government tried to bury. You know what happened in that market, and in that warehouse on the outskirts of Texcoco. You know about Elena and Roberto and Dr. Salinas. You know about the 18 bodies and the hundreds more that may never be counted. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. You can share this story with others, spreading awareness of a case that deserves to be remembered. You can ask questions about food safety in your own community, refusing to accept easy answers when something feels wrong. You can simply carry the knowledge with you, another piece of the truth about what humans are capable of doing to each other. Or, you can try to forget. You can close this video and return to your normal life, trusting that the markets where you shop are safe, that the vendors who serve you are honest, that the meat you buy is exactly what it appears to be. I will not tell you which choice is right. Elena Morales spent 30 years wondering if she had chosen correctly. Maria spent 42 years in ignorance before learning a truth that transformed her understanding of her own life. Carlos chose to protect his children from knowledge that his parents tried to protect him from. There are no easy answers. There is only the question. And the question will stay with you long after this video ends. Next week I will tell you about the boarding house in San Luis Potosí. A story about identity theft that goes far beyond what that term usually means. A story about people who vanished and other people who took their places. A story about the price of starting over and the cost of erasing the past. Subscribe now if you want to hear it. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the upload. Thank you for watching until. Thank you for carrying this story with you. And thank you for being brave enough to choose truth when ignorance would have been so much easier. The city is always hungry. The truth is always waiting. Go find it. One final thing. During my research, I came across a detail that I almost did not include in this story. It seemed too strange, too coincidental to be true. But multiple sources confirmed it independently, so I will share it with you now. In 2019, a construction crew working on a new apartment building in the area where the San Juan Market once stood made an unexpected discovery. While excavating the foundation, they found human bones. The bones were old, weathered by decades underground. Forensic analysis estimated they had been buried sometime in the 1960s. There were remains from at least 3 different individuals, all adults, all showing signs of having been dismembered with surgical precision. The discovery was reported to local authorities and briefly investigated. The official conclusion was that the bones were probably the remains of victims of violence from that era, buried by perpetrators who were long since dead. The case was closed without further action. But some researchers who examined the reports noticed something troubling. The bones were found less than 50 meters from where Aurelio Mendoza's stall had once stood. The dismemberment patterns matched what forensic experts would expect from someone with medical training. And the estimated burial date overlapped with the period when the San Juan Market was operating. Were these bones connected to the case? Were they remains that Dr. Ramirez buried rather than processed? Were they victims whose bodies, for whatever reason, were not suitable for his usual purposes? Nobody will ever. The bones were reburied in a public cemetery without individual identification. No DNA analysis was conducted. No attempt was made to connect them to missing persons reports from the 1960s. Another secret buried. Another truth that will never be fully known. I share this detail because it illustrates something important about cases like this one. We think of them as closed, as finished, as belonging to the past. But the past has a way of surfacing when we least expect it. Bones emerge from construction sites. Documents leak from classified files. Old men confess on their deathbeds. Old women form support groups to process traumas that are half a century old. The San Juan Market case is not over. It will never be over. It lives in the ground beneath Mexico City. It lives in the memories of survivors. It lives in the stories we tell each other about the darkness that hides in familiar places. And now, it lives in you. Remember this story. Not because dwelling on horror makes the world better, but because remembering is a form of respect. Respect for the victims who were never properly mourned. Respect for the investigators who risked everything to expose the truth. Respect for the families who have carried impossible knowledge for decades. They deserve to be remembered. They all do. The 18 confirmed victims of the warehouse. The hundreds more who may have passed through that facility over 3 years. The families who ate at those Sunday dinners without knowing what they were consuming. The inspectors who died under suspicious circumstances trying to uncover similar operations. Elena Morales, who spent 30 years in silence and died wishing she had spoken sooner. Roberto Mendoza, who broke down trying to process what he had seen. Dr. Salinas, who never ate meat again after confirming the samples were human. Maria and her support group, who meet twice a month to share a burden that most people cannot imagine. Carlos, who chose to protect his children from the same knowledge that his parents protected him from. All of them deserve to be remembered. All of them are part of this story, and now you are part of it too. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for choosing truth. The city is always hungry, but you know what it has been fed, and knowing makes you different from everyone who does not. Use that difference wisely. Until next week, stay safe, stay curious, stay human. Goodbye.